The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted through my kitchen window as I pulled the last batch from the oven at 5:30 a.m. Saturday mornings were my busiest time at Sweet Dreams Bakery, the home-based business I'd been running for 3 years from my converted garage. By 7 a.m., I'd have 24 regular customers lined up for their weekend treats, and by noon my inventory would be completely sold out. I'd spent 2 years getting every permit, license and health department approval required to operate a legal home bakery in our city. The process had been exhausting. Health inspections, zoning approvals, business licenses, food handler certification. But I'd done everything by the book because I knew that running a food business from home would attract scrutiny from neighbors who didn't understand the regulations. Most of my neighbors had been supportive. Mrs. Patterson next door often praised my apple turnovers, and the young couple across the street were regular customers for my chocolate chip cookies. But Robert Henley, who lived in the oversized McMansion 2 houses down, had made his disapproval clear from the moment I'd started operating. "This is a residential neighborhood," he declared during our first confrontation 6 months ago, when he'd marched over while I was setting up my weekend display table. "We didn't buy homes here to live next to some commercial operation." Robert was the kind of man who wore pressed khakis to check his mailbox and maintained his lawn with the precision of a golf course superintendent. At 52, he owned a successful accounting firm downtown and never missed an opportunity to remind the neighborhood that his property taxes were probably higher than most people's annual salaries. "I have all the proper permits, Mr. Henley," I'd explained patiently, showing him my city-issued home occupation license. "The city allows home-based food businesses with proper licensing." He'd examine my permit with the dismissive attention of someone looking for flaws. "We'll see about that," he'd muttered before stalking back to his house. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, Robert had found increasingly creative ways to express his displeasure. He'd file noise complaints about my 5 a.m. baking schedule, despite the fact that my kitchen was insulated and I used equipment specifically designed for quiet operation. He'd complain to the Homeowners Association about the commercial traffic my Saturday customers generated, even though most walked from the neighborhood and the few who drove parked legally on the street. What Robert didn't know was that my background wasn't actually in baking. It was in forensic accounting. I'd spent 15 years working for the IRS, investigating tax fraud and unreported income before starting my bakery as a semi-retirement project. Old habits die hard, and I developed the unconscious tendency to notice financial discrepancies in my daily life. Like the fact that Robert claimed to live alone in his expensive house while consistently having different cars parked in his driveway overnight. Or the way he'd mentioned his rental properties to other neighbors while simultaneously complaining about property taxes as if he only owned his primary residence. Or the pattern of young professionals I'd seen coming and going from his house with moving boxes and furniture. This morning, as I arranged fresh pastries in my display case, I noticed Robert standing on his front porch with his phone pressed to his ear, staring directly at my setup. His body language radiated satisfaction in a way that made my stomach tighten with anticipation. 20 minutes later, a white city van pulled up in front of my house. 2 men in official-looking polo shirts climbed out, clipboards in hand, and walked toward my bakery display. Behind them, Robert emerged from his house with the self-satisfied stride of someone who'd just scored a victory. "Are you the operator of this food establishment?" asked the taller inspector, a middle-aged man with graying temples and tired eyes. "I am. I'm Sarah Martinez, owner of Sweet Dreams Bakery." I wiped my hands on my apron, mentally preparing for what I knew was coming. "We've received a complaint about an illegal food operation," the second inspector said, consulting his clipboard. "The complainant alleges you're operating a commercial kitchen without proper permits and potentially violating health codes." Robert had positioned himself at the edge of my driveway, close enough to hear every word but far enough to maintain plausible deniability about his involvement. His expression was a masterpiece of false concern mixed with barely contained glee. "I'd be happy to show you my permits," I said calmly, reaching for the folder I kept specifically for these occasions. "I have my home occupation license, food handler's permit, and all required health department approvals." The inspectors examined my documentation with professional thoroughness. As they reviewed each permit, I watched Robert's confident expression begin to waver slightly. "These all appear to be in order," the first inspector said after several minutes. Your kitchen setup meets commercial standards and all your licenses are current. He looked around at my organized display, noting the proper temperature controls and sanitary conditions. Frankly, this is one of the most professionally run home bakeries I've seen. So she can keep operating? Robert called out, abandoning any pretense that he wasn't the complainant. The inspector turned toward him with mild irritation. Sir, this business is fully licensed and compliant with all city regulations. There's no violation here. Robert's face flushed red. But this is a residential neighborhood. She's running a commercial operation out of her garage. Which is perfectly legal with proper permits, the second inspector replied. Home-based food businesses are specifically allowed under City Code 15.2.7, as long as they meet health and safety requirements. I watched Robert struggle to process this information. He'd been so confident that his complaint would shut me down, so certain that I was operating illegally, that he hadn't considered the possibility that I might actually know what I was doing. Maybe now you'll get a real job instead of poisoning the neighborhood, Robert snapped, his frustration boiling over into open hostility. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Both inspectors looked uncomfortable at the naked aggression in Robert's voice. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, but the familiar clarity that came when someone pushed me too far. Actually, Mr. Henley, I said quietly, my voice carrying the professional calm I'd perfected during 15 years of conducting IRS investigations. Since we're discussing business operations and city compliance, I should mention that I've been documenting some interesting patterns in your rental income reporting. Robert went very still. What are you talking about? I smiled pleasantly, the same expression I'd used when presenting evidence to tax evaders who thought they were smarter than the system. Well, you've mentioned your rental properties to several neighbors, and I've noticed quite a bit of residential turnover at your address. Young professionals moving in and out with furniture, different cars in your driveway every few months. It's created an interesting pattern that someone with my background tends to notice. Your background? Robert's voice had lost its earlier confidence. I spent 15 years as a forensic accountant with the IRS before starting my bakery. Old habits, you know. I can't help but notice discrepancies between reported income and observed lifestyle patterns. The inspectors were watching this exchange with growing interest. Robert's face had gone from red to pale in the span of 30 seconds. For instance, I continued conversationally, rental income from your primary residence would need to be reported on your tax returns. And if you're claiming homestead exemptions while simultaneously operating a rental business from the same property, well, that creates some interesting compliance questions. Robert opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. I could practically see his mental gears grinding as he tried to figure out exactly how much I knew and how much I was guessing. Of course, I'm retired from that line of work now, I said, turning back to the inspectors with a smile. I much prefer baking to investigating tax fraud. Speaking of which, would either of you gentlemen like to try a cinnamon roll? They're fresh from the oven. The inspectors accepted my offer gratefully, probably happy to defuse the tension that had suddenly developed between Robert and me. As they bit into the warm pastries, both made appreciative sounds. These are incredible, the first inspector said. You've definitely got the right permits for the right business. After the inspectors left with boxes of pastries for their colleagues, Robert and I stood in my driveway facing each other. The satisfied gloating had completely disappeared from his expression, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. What exactly do you think you know? He asked quietly. I considered my answer carefully. During my IRS years, I'd learned that the most effective investigations started with letting subjects know they were being watched without revealing the full scope of what you'd discovered. I know that rental income has to be reported as taxable income, Robert. And I know that claiming homestead exemptions on property that's being used for rental purposes constitutes tax fraud. I paused, letting that sink in. I also know that the IRS pays attention to tips from credible sources, especially when those sources have forensic accounting backgrounds. Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at his expensive house with new eyes. What do you want? I want to run my legal licensed bakery without harassment from neighbors who don't understand city regulations. I want to serve my customers without someone calling false complaints to shut me down. I met his eyes directly. Basically, I want to be left alone to do my job. The transformation in Robert's behavior over the following weeks was remarkable. No more noise complaints, no more homeowners association protests, no more hostile glares when I set up my Saturday display. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid any interaction with me whatsoever. But my forensic instincts had been activated, and I found myself paying closer attention to the patterns I'd been noticing for months. Robert's rental business was more extensive than I'd initially realized. He was operating what appeared to be a short-term rental operation from his primary residence, rotating tenants every few months while claiming homestead exemptions that reduced his property taxes. 3 weeks after the inspector incident, I was reviewing my own business records when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I recognized from my IRS days. "Sarah, it's Jim Morrison from Criminal Investigation. How's retirement treating you?" Jim had been my partner on several major fraud cases. We'd stayed in touch after I'd left the agency, and he occasionally asked for informal consultation on cases that fell into my areas of expertise. "It's treating me well, Jim. Though I seem to have stumbled across something that might interest your department." "Oh. Still can't turn off the investigative instincts." I looked out my kitchen window toward Robert's house, where a young couple was loading boxes into a U-Haul truck. The third tenant turnover I'd witnessed in 6 months. Something like that. I've got a neighbor who's operating what appears to be an unreported rental business while claiming homestead exemptions. The income pattern suggests significant underreporting. Jim's voice became more focused. "Tell me more." I spent the next 20 minutes walking Jim through my observations. The pattern of short-term tenants, the rental income that almost certainly wasn't being reported, the homestead exemption fraud, the discrepancy between Robert's claimed residential status and his actual business operations. "How solid is your documentation?" Jim asked. "Solid enough to justify opening an investigation. I've got photos, dates, rental patterns, property records. If someone wanted to build a case, the foundation is already there. And you're willing to serve as a confidential informant if we pursue this?" I thought about Robert's smug satisfaction as he'd called the city to shut down my legal business. His sneer when he told me to get a real job. His assumption that he could harass a neighbor without consequences. Absolutely. The IRS investigation took 6 months to complete. During that time, Robert's behavior toward me remained studiously polite. He'd nod when we saw each other getting mail, but he never tried to engage in conversation. I suspected he knew something was coming but wasn't sure what or when. The first sign that the investigation was concluding came when I noticed Robert's real estate agent putting up a "for sale" sign in his front yard. The second sign was the official-looking sedan that parked in front of his house one Tuesday morning, followed by 2 men in suits carrying briefcases. Jim called me that afternoon. "We're closing the investigation today. Your neighbor has agreed to pay back taxes, penalties, and interest totaling $47,000. He's also agreed to sell the property and relocate rather than face criminal charges." I felt a familiar satisfaction, the same feeling I'd gotten when fraudsters realized they'd finally been caught. How much income was he hiding? About $180,000 over 3 years. He was operating a short-term rental business, reporting maybe 20% of his actual income, and claiming homestead exemptions the entire time. Pretty brazen, honestly. That evening, Robert knocked on my door for the first time since the inspector incident. He stood on my porch looking older than his 52 years, his usual arrogance replaced by exhausted defeat. "I know it was you," he said quietly. "I didn't deny it. You called the city to shut down my legal business because you didn't like having a neighbor who worked from home. Unfortunately for you, you picked the wrong neighbor to mess with." Robert nodded slowly. "The house goes on the market officially tomorrow. I'll be gone by the end of next month. Good luck with your fresh start, Robert. Maybe in your new neighborhood, you'll think twice before harassing people who haven't done anything wrong." After he left, I stood in my kitchen preparing the next day's inventory, thinking about how differently things might have gone if Robert had simply minded his own business. If he'd accepted that my bakery was legal and properly licensed. If he'd chosen tolerance over harassment. Instead, he'd targeted someone with the exact professional background needed to recognize and investigate his own illegal activities. The irony was almost perfect. A tax fraud case developed because the perpetrator tried to shut down a legal business operated by a former IRS investigator. 6 months later, my bakery is thriving more than ever. Without Robert's constant complaints and harassment, I've been able to expand my Saturday hours and add Sunday afternoon service. The new neighbors who bought Robert's house are a young family who've become regular customers for my chocolate chip cookies. Sometimes I think about Robert's parting words. Maybe now you'll get a real job instead of poisoning the neighborhood. He'd meant it as an insult, but it revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of who he was dealing with. I had gotten a real job. I'd spent 15 years investigating people exactly like him. The difference was that now I got to bake cinnamon rolls while doing it. And occasionally when someone tried to shut down my legal business through false complaints and harassment, I got to remind them that forensic accounting skills never really go away. They just get repurposed into more satisfying forms of justice.